I'm Paul Stacey, the Associate Director of Global Learning for Creative Commons.
How long have you been working at Creative Commons, and what's been your role there since you were in the organization?
So I've been at Creative Commons over 3 years, and I came initially to work primarily in the education space, but have ended up diversifying from just doing education to working across all of the sectors, including work in policy, work in some of the museum activity, work with creative industries. It's been fun.
I know that you've been recently shifting a little bit from your education background at first into a more business-oriented program. So what led you to that?
So I started working with Creative Commons licenses in 2003, and one of the questions we always get asked is, how do I sustain a living and earn a livelihood when I'm openly licensing my work with Creative Commons and making it freely available for others to use? And this question has largely remained unanswered. And I think it's a critical question that not only creators have, but governments have and institutions have. And so I became very interested in digging into how people are doing it, because it is happening already, and decided to start a new initiative around open business models.
Okay, I've seen during your keynote that you had a case for education textbooks and the cost of sharing it versus the cost of buying it. Was that did that have any influence in this shift as well?
Well, I think that there is increasingly some good arguments to be made around the economics of sharing. But I think that one of the other motivations I've had is that it's not just about money. And I think that there are a lot of other benefits and a lot of other value propositions associated with sharing that sometimes are just as important, if not more important, than the financial ones. And I'd like to uncover those as well.
Okay. One of the things that you've been advocating for is this concept of maximizing abundance versus the artificial scarcity. Can you?
Sure. So this is sort of a thought and idea that emerged for me over the last few months, which is that when it comes to digital goods in particular, they can be easily copied and distributed and stored for virtually $0. So as soon as we start to restrict any of those pieces, the copying of them, the distributing of them, or the storing of them, it creates a form of artificial scarcity, which seems to be a reaction that we've had to digital goods that tries to force them to behave as if they're more resource-based kinds of goods, which truly can become scarce and rivalrous. And so I've become very interested in how do businesses work if you don't try to make things artificially scarce, but instead utilize and maximize their abundance as a significant strategy and tactic for your business. I think that's a whole new way of operating. And interestingly, economists, and just in general, have not studied abundance very much and almost always are focused on scarcity.
You've mentioned a bunch of examples of open business models. Is there any case that you would particularly emphasize as the business model, not so much the example of the company, but in terms of how do you make money by giving your work for free, which is the million-dollar question all the time.
Yes. Yeah, I would say that I don't have one sort of sweet example that I would always want to use. So what I've been finding is that there are different examples, not all of them based on money, Fatima. So I think this idea that it's always about money is a bit of a fallacy. And so I think it's important to think about which model might make most sense for a particular business or person or organization that wants to go that way, and identify what what they see as the value or what their mission or vision is that they're trying to accomplish, and how going open can help them fulfill that. And so it isn't always about money, and as a result, I'm reluctant actually to give the simple one-off answer, because this seems to be what most people want. It's just tell me the answer, tell me what I need to do in order to get rich, and still be open. And I think that that's, actually think it's not the right question, I guess.
You've talked about the sharing city case.
Yeah.
How do you feel that conflicts with the sharing economy examples that we've been used to learn about? And I don't want to mention names, but you know what I mean.
Well, I think the sharing economy has been, in a sense, misnamed. There's not a lot of sharing going on with most of the sharing economy example businesses, whether it's cars or sharing housing. Usually those are not so much sharing as much as a new form of rental fee being charged, where the money flows not to some business but to the individual who owns that car or house, but often with a significant percentage going to some third-party intermediary still, which is very similar to traditional market-based ways of doing things. And so the sharing cities, I think, are trying to take control over that and not have it be so dominated by third parties, but instead to actually look at it as a public service. And so to what extent can things like libraries and schools and office buildings be better utilized within a sharing city context, not to necessarily benefit some third-party company, but instead to deliberately benefit the citizens. And I think taking ownership over the sharing economy and having it truly become a sharing economy is a wonderful aspiration for some cities to take.
Do you think that making the economic case is the next step, or is an important step for Creative Commons to influence policy making and actually contribute for copyright reform?
I think it is, actually. Yeah, I do think that there is an economic case to be made. It hasn't been made yet. I think there's a benefit not only for copyright reform, but also a benefit for us to get the private sector more involved in Creative Commons use, because for the most part, the licenses have been widely adopted by creators themselves and by government and institutions and nonprofit organizations, not so much by the for-profits. And I think if we could show that there is an economic case, then we'd see a lot more adoption and use by the private sector as well.
Okay. A few words about the future. What's your vision for it?
I think that we're in a transition period right now where it's actually kind of messy and tricky, because in some ways we're still very much dominated by traditional market economics, and at the same time I see a new emerging form of practice and a form of living that's starting to surface but hasn't yet fully surfaced. And so we're having to have a foot in the old world while we're tentatively taking a step into the new world. Part of the new world from my point of view, as you maybe heard in my keynote, was that there's a growing potential to think about things not just from your local region perspective, but globally. And I think that when we start to think globally, then we start to take actions that not only benefit us and our regional local interests, but also have some potential consideration of the larger context of the world. I also think that there's a necessity to think not just about those of us who are alive right now, but also the future. And so I think that in addition to thinking globally, we need to be thinking about future generations and making some decisions based on that. Neither of those things, the future generations or global, usually come into consideration when we're talking about traditional market economics. So I think we're in a transition period. I think that it'll be a fairly long time, I believe, while we'll still be operating largely under traditional economics. But I think that many people, are increasingly looking for a new alternative to that, because they've become dissatisfied with the growing economic inequality that exists around the world, and there's a desire to have there be more equitable distribution of wealth, and also a recognition that growth isn't necessarily something we can continue to do forever, and that we need to instead adopt more sustainable practices. And so I think a lot of the work that I'm doing currently is all about how do we become more sustainable, how do we still come up with mechanisms for people to earn a living while being considerate of the world at large and of future generations.
Thank you very much.
Okay.